Welcome to another month of Skill Builders. My name is Joanne Knight.
And I'm Joyce Lundergan. We're glad you're here. This month we're doing a stadium throw, and a few of the techniques that we'll be covering are nested patterns using fill at the top and at the bottom, which is why we'll be using repeat patterns, keeping the quilt straight when we roll, alternating this nested pattern, sewing left to right and right to left, relocating to keep the pattern running square down the quilt, adding letters in a boundary, and dealing with stretchy backs. For this quilt, we're using a fleece back.
And we're also using Thermore for our batting because it's a thin batting and we don't want anything that is so heavy you don't want to carry it around with you. Our fabric on the top is it's a really lightweight canvas kind of fabric, I guess is what you would call it. So the Thermore and then the fleece backing is going to make a really nice weight for this. We are using Omni thread because we want the stitches to be real secure on it, to be that little bit heavier weight of thread to be able to do this. So Joyce, tell us what considerations we had for loading this fleece backing.
We didn't have a lot of choices in this case because our top is directional. The fleece backing was directional, so we had to load it with salvages on the side, which is a typical way that I deal with the minky or fleece backing. What we did was to measure our leaders to match the width of the backing when we loaded it. So this backing, this fleece was 60 inches wide, so we measured 30 inches from the center, marked those, and then pinned to the markings, both top and bottom. When we were done, we had a little sag, and so we rolled the quilt backing forward and back, and we were able to take care of that.
It did. It helped tremendously, and we also have little dowel rods, which I typically use, and you can get them from any home supply store, and we put those underneath our clamps, and depending on how close or how far away you have them to the clamp is going to provide whatever amount of lift that you need on those sides. That helps a lot of times whenever you've got side borders that are sagging a little bit, and they're really easy to use and really easy to do. A lot of people use yardsticks on the side to be able to get that even tension. So we're just being real careful with it, and we're going to check the back before we do every roll to make sure that everything is the way it needs to be on the back. We loaded it in with our channel locks like we normally do because this piece has a vertical seam. So we were able to check the horizontal and the vertical channel locks to be able to get it in as best we could.
I think we're ready to set the patterns up and get going.
I think we are too. The patterns that we are giving you this month are 4 different geometric type modern look patterns. They do say P2P and they are point to point patterns, and you know that because of your markers. But what we wanted to do is give you patterns that would fit most any sport for whatever stadium blanket that you wanted to use. So the one that we're going to use in our example is this SB P2P Web 2, this pattern right here. We are using repeat patterns rather than edge-to-edge automatic because we do want to fill the entire top row at one time, and we want to use a relocate as we roll the quilt instead of using end of set. And if we did relocate shift all to one point in edge-to-edge automatic, it would throw us into repeat patterns. As a quick reminder, you want to go to Service, Technical Support, left click on Controller Definition, and you want your reference point to be upper left and not start point. So that's just a little reminder for you. The next thing that we want to do is start a new quilt group because Creative Studio is not going to start a new quilt group with repeat patterns. It is also not going to give us a boundary with repeat patterns like it does with edge-to-edge automatic. So we're going to click out a boundary of our sewable area so that we can make sure that we are where we want to be and how many rows of patterns we can sew. Because we are going to fill the top, we are clicking a little bit above our basting line where we did our channel lock and basted in our basting line, because we want that fill over stitching to be in the binding area. So Joyce is going to click this out. She can click as many clicks as she wants to because we're in repeat patterns, and she could even do a channel lock if she wanted to be able to place that boundary on a nice straight line. We're going to come all the way down to our belly bar because we want to make the most use of our sewable space. Go over to the other side. Go over to the other side and make that boundary as straight as we can. Once we do that, then we are able to go into our repeat pattern setup, and we will have a visual on the screen of what our sewable area is. Now we're going to go to repeat patterns because we have our boundary, and in version 7, Creative Studio makes us put the first pattern on the screen. And you can put your crosshair to that upper left, or you can just click it with the mouse. So we're going to place that pattern. We decided that this pattern was just a little bit too small for our stadium blanket. We want it to be soft and cuddly, and we just want it to have good texture in it. So we decided that the height of the pattern would be better served to be 7 inches. So we're going to change that to 7 inches, and freeze aspect is on. So Creative Studio is going to adjust the pattern symmetrically. Now we're going to go and set our total height and our total width, and Joyce is going to talk to you about the spacing.
So our total width is 50.5, and you can use a decimal in the set total size boxes. The total height is 64.5, and after you type, if you move your mouse to the CAD, then it accepts what you've entered.
We don't want this much spacing between it, and we don't want them lined up this symmetrically. It does kind of look like a little snowball or something, but that's not what we want for this quilt. We're doing all over quilting. So what we're going to do is alternate that pattern and alternate the rows. So we're going to go to alternating, and we're going to do plus row on top. It doesn't make any difference. You can do either one that you want to. And now we have to look at the grid, which is still at 1 inch, to see what our spacing needs to be.
We need negative spacing to bring them closer together, and that's negative vertical spacing because we want them to nest closer together.
One thing that Creative Studio does, and I think it's important to mention right here, is when it is talking about that 64.5 inch height, it is measuring from the tip top of that pattern on the first row to the bottom point of the pattern on the last row. So it's not taking into consideration those gaps at the top or the bottom. It's going from the top of a sewable pattern to the bottom of that sewable pattern.
Now, it has adjusted the pattern based on our width and height, but we need to change the vertical spacing. So I'm going to try a negative 2.5, and now you see that it stretched the pattern. And if you want to keep the pattern more symmetrical, there is a reset to original button in the setup box. So I'm going to click on that, and now you'll see that reset to original takes that pattern back to the design size of 5.5 by 5, which is what we decided we didn't want. We wanted it to be more open. So we're going to cancel out of this and show you another way to accomplish this, an easier way.
Because if we change the size now, we'd keep doing the same thing over and over again. The more we change the vertical spacing, the more skewed it would be. When we reset to original, it'd go back to 5. So it's just not something that you want to fight. There is a better way to do that.
Correct. So we're going to cancel out of this setup, and what we're going to do is to select the pattern and press P on your keyboard or right click and select View Properties. And we're going to change that height in the pattern properties in the Project tab.
That's very important that it's in the Project tab and not the Pattern tab.
And aspect ratio is on, and so we get the same numbers that we did in the repeat pattern setup box, but this time when we go to repeat patterns and we first click that upper left, then it comes in at the height of 7 inches.
Exactly, because now it thinks that that's the original size.
So now we're going to change the set total sizes, and the width is 50.5, 50.5, and 64.5, and just like before, we're going to change it to be alternating with plus row on top, and then we need a vertical, negative vertical spacing, so I'll do minus 2.5, and now you see that it's skewed, but this time when we click on Reset to Original, then you'll see it comes back to the height of 7 inches by 768, which is what we changed it to in the Project tab.
And it keeps that vertical spacing. So now we have a nice symmetrical pattern and we have that vertical spacing.
But we still have more to deal with, because
Correct.
when we changed that size reset to original, then our total size and total height changed. So this is how we'll deal with that. We're going to go to Set Repeats and Rows, and we're going to click on that lock. So now when we change repeats and rows, we can
Watch the total size. We're watching the total height. Our total width is okay. So all we need to do is just add rows on there, because the left side, the pattern is split in half, and that's what we want. We'll probably adjust the right size to split it in half, but we don't need to add any more repeats. We need to add rows. So as we click to add rows, we'll watch that total height until we get greater than the 64.5.
And if we have a negative vertical spacing of minus 2.5, we probably want to throw in even an extra row, because we'll be filling at the top and at the bottom.
Right, we've got to move those patterns up. We've got to take them and physically move them up so that we don't have that gap at the top. So even though we have a total height of 70 inches, and that's a good bit more than the size of our quilt, we want to have those to be able to have our playroom and be able to fill those. So I think we're pretty happy with that setup.
Right, so if you're happy and when you're happy, click OK.
Now we do our manual adjusting.
So we want to fill these gaps at the top. To make it easy, instead of trying to use your mouse and move things, you can use your nudge, and big nudge moves about 1/2 inch. So I'm going to hold Control and the up arrow, and I'm going to move it up until I'm happy. And I think I want it to adjust so that it cuts off just about at this little
point right there.
So when I get close, then I will use my little nudge, which is Alt and up arrow, and we'll move it up ever so slightly until we're there at the edge.
Right. And we will pull this right side just ever so slightly so the point of that repeat is pretty much on that line. Now remember, we clicked our boundary in the binding area, okay? So that's going to go over in the binding areas, but it's pleasing looking on the screen. So if it's pleasing looking on the screen, then we're fine.
Right. So one more fun thing to do with a pattern like this, to give it a little bit more character, is to flip horizontally every other row to give it a little different look. And then that will allow us to connect the rows, or they connect when we do fill, so that they will stitch from left to right and then right to left.
Without stopping.
Without stopping.
And you will also notice that we have no teal markers in the middle of this setup. So in the middle of that quilt, in the body of the quilt, we have no teal markers, and that means that every pattern is going to sew continuously until it gets to the end.
They're connected.
And sometimes you get a completely different look whenever you flip every other row.
So let's do that. Because there's only a small gap between these, an easy way to grab them all is to left click with your mouse, hold it down, and just drag straight across, almost like a line, and it will select all those patterns. Then you can flip horizontal.
Or hit the letter X on your keyboard.
Correct. So we're going to select every other row after we've done that first one. And we want to do this before we start stitching so that we don't get partway down the quilt and forget that we meant to do that. So I'm going to select that one and flip horizontal.
You also want to make sure once you select it and once you let go of that left mouse button, you want to make sure that the only thing that is yellow or the only thing that is selected is that one row.
Right. So I'm going to step down through here and flip every other, and we'll be right back. So the last thing that we're going to do, or the next to the last thing we're going to do before we get ready to stitch, is that we need to fill these rows so that we don't get the extra pattern. And because we flipped every other row, then the top row stitches from left to right, the second row stitches right to left. Then after we do fill, they will automatically connect, because fill looks for the next closest start point and it will connect them for us.
It makes a sewable line from that pattern to its next place that it has to go. So there's no need to do any manual connections. We're saving all that time by doing that. It makes a much more interesting pattern because we flipped every other row. But you want to be careful that we're only selecting the rows that are within our sewable area. And in this case, we can fit 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but that fifth row is a little too close to that belly bar for us for comfort because of shrinkage. So we're only going to select 4 and do fill.
Right, because once you do fill, it combines the patterns, and so if we had selected all 5 and filled and only wanted to stitch 4, it's going to go to stitch that last row, because it is all one pattern after we've filled. So I'm going to select the top 4 rows, and I'm going to go to fill,
and it will be an inside fill.
We'll check to make sure it's inside, and then click, left click to fill. And just that quick, we've filled those patterns. Now, the last step is to remember to toggle the patterns that are not going to be stitched and are outside of the sewable area, and toggle those patterns as sewn. You can click, if you have it in your tool strip, click on that, or right click and toggle group sewn.
It's an easy visual for you that these are the patterns that are not sewn, because they're the ones that have not been filled yet. So they still have this extra line of patterns out here on the side. We like to toggle these patterns as sewn just because that is a good visual for us. The other thing you would need to do, and it's also a safer bet, if this start and end of this next row is close to the pattern row that you are sewing, then Creative Studio will make that transition and it will go ahead and start sewing that next pattern row, and we don't want it to do that. It's just better to toggle them as sewn, and then that way you don't have to be concerned about it.
Right. Are we ready to stitch?
We're ready to stitch.
All right, we're going to stitch these 4 rows out and then we'll be back.
We have quilted the first 4 rows of our little stadium throw, and we are not putting the letter in the boundary, because if we put the letter in the boundary with our colored felt, you are not going to be able to get to the center of the quilt, so you're not going to be able to relocate and find the point underneath the letter. So what we're suggesting is that you quilt the stadium throw all the way through and then go back and put your felt letters on there, and we will of course show you how to do that. We have rolled the quilt, and this point on the crosshair that you see right now, and I'm going to change my grid to about 5 so it's easier. That point that you see on the crosshair is actually this point right here where my mouse is. And what we love about doing a point, relocate, shift all to one point, is that this crosshair shoots a vertical line down through this quilt, so you are able to see and you are able to gauge just how much shrinkage you have on a pattern. And that shoots a horizontal line across, so you are really able to tell a little bit from the horizontal and make sure that you're staying square. We again based it in and did the channel lock down those 2 seam lines and also across the block seam with horizontal channel lock. Vertical channel lock was the side seams or the inside seams. So now we are ready to relocate. We want to explain to you the difference between the relocates, the 2 relocates. I'm going to take the patterns, the next grouping of patterns, being real careful not to get the ones that we just sewed, and I am going to toggle them as unsewn so that you can have a better visual of what we're going to do. It's another one of those good Statler habits. We have rolled the quilt. This point again is at this position down here in this row. When you do a relocate, shift all to 2 points, I'm going to select the pattern and I'm going to right click and I'm going to go down to relocate, and you have several options there. We're going to be dealing with shift all to 2 points and shift all to 1 point. The first one we're going to talk about is shift all to 2 points. If I left click with the pattern selected, Creative Studio is going to say, give me a point on the computer screen, the first point on the computer screen. This point is telling Creative Studio how far did you roll the quilt up? Where is the new location as far as the height of the quilt? That second point on the computer screen that you're going to click is the angle of the quilt. In other words, is the quilt getting out of square and you need to get it back into square? That's what that's going to do, and it's just going to be a matter of following the prompts on the screen to be able to do that. I'm going to hit escape. The one that we like to use when it is a pattern like this that needs to stay in line is to select the pattern, right click, go down to relocate, shift all to 1 point. Where one goes, everybody goes. And the reason that we like to use this one is again because you can see that crosshair going down through the center of that quilt, and that helps to us to keep it more in line and more straight. So we have the machine head right at this point. I'm going to scroll in really close and I'm going to bring it down so you can see it. Up here where this crosshair is at this point of this pattern right here. Make sure that your snaps are off. It doesn't have to be the beginning or the ending of the pattern. It is best not to choose a curve because you're going to have a difficult time trying to find a point in this curve. But if we click this point right here on that little pattern and I do a left click, Creative Studio is going to say click yes when the machine head is at the same point on the quilt. It has to be a pattern that you have sewn, or you wouldn't be able to click it from the quilt. Our machine head is in the correct spot. Joyce is going to click yes from the machine head, and you're going to see that all of those patterns are going to move up, and you're going to find them in the sewable space. Boundaries do not move, only patterns move. If you mess up and you want to roll the quilt a little farther, then you can, and you can do the relocate over again if you want to. It's not something that you do one time and you're done. Remember, we flipped every other row? So because we did that, we don't have to stop and wonder whether we did that or not. And of course, with these patterns, you can see whether you did or whether you didn't. What we like to do, the boundary is highlighted. We're going to hit the word delete, or the delete key on our keyboard, and we're going to click a new boundary, because we want to make absolutely sure that we have enough space. Patterns are back lined up again, and we want to make sure that they are still where they need to be and how much sewable space we have, because that last row of patterns may have been just a little bit close to that belly bar, and every time we're going to come down to the belly bar. Now I want to be sure and tell you, we timed this when we did these first 4 rows of patterns, and it took us 8 minutes to quilt that out, which is pretty fast. We didn't have to stop. All we had to do was just let it do what it was going to do, because Creative Studio sewed left to right and then right to left. I can tell a difference in that boundary, Joyce, can you? The patterns on this row are no longer as close to the belly bar as they were before. So where we might have left out this 1, 2, 3, 4th row and not sewn it, now I think we're safe to go ahead and sew that 4th row. So what we're going to do is we can easily see that we can stitch 4 rows of the pattern. So we're going to be able to do that, which should or should not take us about 8 minutes or so at speed 13. We're going to be able to do that, and so it's not going to take us long to get this little quilt done. We have to do our fill first, so we're going to select all of the rows, being careful not to get the top rows and being careful not to get that next row, because we've got 4 rows, and we're going to do fill inside because we only have 1 boundary. Creative Studio is going to fill those. We're going to toggle the ones below it as sewn again. And we're going to go and stitch this out. So we will be right back.
So we've stitched those 4 rows, and we've rolled, basted, kept everything square. We use channel locks again, as we always do. Now we're going to select the last few rows that need to be stitched and toggle those as unsewn so we have a good visual. And we're going to go in, and this is the point where we are going to relocate all to 1 point. And we have our machine head lined up at that same section. So we're going to select patterns again and right click, relocate, shift all to 1 point. Zoom in, and it's this point right here that we want to relocate. That's our point. I'm going to click on the CAD, click your known point on the CAD, and then Joanne is going to click that same point on the quilt.
Which you can do either from the computer screen or the keypad. Either one, it doesn't make any difference. And if your machine tends to drift a little bit, if your table is not completely level and your machine tends to drift a little bit, you need to keep one hand on that machine so it stays at that point.
So next we're going to select our boundary. You can use K or L on your keyboard to select your boundary, and then press delete on the keyboard, and we'll click a new boundary.
Joyce, it will be a good time probably to mention to them what if they make this pattern smaller and it's more dense. Talk about that just a minute, please, while I click this boundary.
Sure. If we were to size this pattern or to use this pattern or one similar that might be 3 inches or even 2 inches, these modern small geometric patterns, and you were able to have 10 or 12 rows that fit in your sewable space, but they need to be lined up to make the pattern keep its symmetry. We would not suggest that all of those rows be stitched at once. You would probably have better results if you mark some of them as sewn, stitch 4 or 5 of them, and then do a relocate, shift all to one point. And you can do that at any time. It doesn't have to be after a roll. And that way you would have smaller segments that you're keeping in line, and quite likely it will be a better result.
Just because you have a sewable boundary that covers up 10 or 12 rows of patterns doesn't mean you have to sew 10 or 12 rows of patterns. Now, ours is staying just really dead on, which I am real happy about, and I'm happy about the density of it. So it's staying pretty true to where it is.
And one of the reasons that contributes to how well it's stitching is because we're stitching left to right and then right to left back, instead of stitching all one direction, which sometimes can tend to make the patterns drift a little bit, or the quilt sandwich to drift a little bit. So alternating the direction of the rows helps to keep things lined up as well.
Controls the shrinkage more, in our opinion. What we want to show you now is we have been sewing 4 rows. This time we can only get 3 rows. Remember, we're using fleece backing, so it's beginning to get a little bit taller and a little bit taller. So we can only hit 3 rows this time. You want to be sure you also check your pickup bar and make sure the pickup bar is being raised as you do this quilt and it's not laying on that quilt.
We're at a point where we can see the bottom of our quilt, and if there's any shrinkage that we need to accommodate, it would be good to be able to distribute the difference over all of the rows instead of getting to the bottom 2 rows or 3 rows and having to adjust a lot. Now, when you have an edge to edge that you're doing where the pattern is at the start and end or at the bottom, it's a little easier. But what we're going to do is we've selected all of the rows that we have not stitched yet, and we have in our height box, our selected pattern properties, 34 inches. And the known point on our quilt that we have is the last stitch here. So we have just about an inch additional than this selected pattern. So we'll measure the quilt from the last stitched pattern to the very bottom of the quilt, and we'll show you that picture. So we have selected patterns of 34 inches. We have an additional inch between the top of the row that's going to stitch next and the last stitch. But remember, we have about 3 inches down here at the bottom that we have to accommodate for fill. So we would only be stitching to about here. So if we take the 35 inches and subtract these 3 that are going to be cut off because of fill, then we have about 32 inches. So for this quilt, we're not having to make any vertical adjustments, and you would do that with your F9 handle and use this arrow to scrunch it up or pull it down just a little bit if you needed to accommodate for a larger or smaller size.
And that's one of the beauties of having this pattern sized at this size as well, because we didn't have that much shrinkage vertically. So that was another reason why we did this pattern at this size. We wanted it to quilt out pretty fast, and we wanted it to look pleasing. So I think we go with what we've got, and then when we get to the bottom and we draw our bottom boundary, then we're good to go.
All right, since we've done our relocate, we've checked the size for all the patterns, we're going to select just those 3 rows, and we're going to do a fill inside.
And it did it just that fast. We're going to toggle those bottom ones as sewn. We're going to quilt this one out, and then we are going to come back to you and show you how we would work with the bottom of the quilt, because it's a little different in repeat patterns than it is in edge to edge. So this little project is going really fast. All of those rows are done, and we are almost finished with our little quilt. So I'm going to select the final patterns, toggle them as unsewn. We're going to do again a relocate, so I'm going to select these patterns. It does not have to be the row that you are on, because remember, when you shift one of them, you shift all of them. And sometimes when you do a relocate, these handles get in your way, and so we tend to pick a pattern that is away from where we're relocating instead of choosing that row. I'm going to right click, I'm going to go down to relocate, shift all to one point, and I am at the bottom of this row and on this right side this time, because remember, it's only 3 rows instead of 4. Left click right there. The machine is at the correct position, so we are going to say yes with a left click on the computer screen, and that rolls that pattern up. Now we definitely want to delete the boundary on this one, so hit the letter K, hit the word delete on your keyboard, and we're going to go and draw a new boundary of our sewable area, because the boundary will no longer be at the belly bar. The entire quilt is up on the machine table now, so we've got to draw a boundary and show us and Creative Studio where that quilt ends. And so that's what we're doing now. This has been a really quick little quilt. Once we get through quilting this, the only thing that we have left to do is put the letters in it. And since we're already down at the bottom of the quilt, it makes sense to do the last letter first. When you're clicking these boundaries, because remember, we are doing fill, when you're clicking these boundaries, you want to be real sure that you don't overlap those boundaries, that you let Creative Studio do the closing of that boundary for you. So we're going to click off of the boundary so that it's no longer selected, and we're going to look at these patterns, and we're going to see now if we want to adjust those.
Right, like we did at the top, we had these little points that we put right at the edge of the binding. So in this case, I think we'll select it, and we'll bring that point down just a tad. And
it's not going to make much difference in the overall look of the quilt, because if Joyce selects off of that pattern, we haven't done a fill yet, so there's still individual patterns. So if she selects one of those patterns, you're going to see that because that little bitty tiny bit was distributed along 4 different rows, it's not going to make much difference in the size of the individual pattern. You can tell that the pattern size is virtually the same as what we started with, because that little tiny adjustment we made with 4 rows instead of just the 1. Again, we don't have to remember to flip those rows because we did that whenever we were started.
A word of caution, as you look at these rows horizontally, you might be tempted to bring these rows and squish them in on this side. If you do that, then what you're doing is taking them out of alignment with what we've already done. So let Phil do its job.
Don't be tempted to go in there and fudge those just a little bit.
Right. We will select all of the 4 rows because they will all fit in the boundary sewable area now, and click on Fill Inside. So we're ready to stitch these last patterns.
Right, and you will again be careful to only select those patterns and not the patterns that were sewn, and we will get this sewn out and then we'll show you right quick how to do the letters on them.
Remember that we only did 3 rows this time, and because every other row alternates whether it starts on left and right, this time the pattern starts on the right, and that's as it should be because we flipped rows.
That's one of the flipped rows because we did 4, 4, 3, and then went back to 4 again. So don't be confused if yours works out that same way and your machine starts running over to the right side.
So we'll stitch these and we'll be right back.
We have got all of our all-over quilting done, and I think that looks really nice. It's really pretty on the quilt. So what we're going to do, we can stay in this quilt group to do our letters, but there's not really any need to, and if we do, you see where our crosshair is, that's where we need to put our first letter. So what we're going to do is just make a new quilt group, and we're going to do draw boundary. Now our piece of felt, and that's what we're using, is not quite as big as our square, so we want to be real careful and draw our boundary on our felt and not on our square, because we want to make sure that that letter is going to cover up that whole piece of felt. We don't have to put any adhesive on the back of it. We just need to make sure that the letter fits. And we are going to do the text to the boundary, the draw text to the boundary, because that way we know that it fits. We do have our felt pretty centered in our square. So now we've got our boundary. We're going to go right here to draw text. We have our boundary selected. We're starting at the bottom, so we need to put our last letter in at the bottom. We are using this font right here. If you go all the way over, I'm scrolling through, the fonts that are in Creative Studio, the block fonts, are determined by the fonts that are on your computer. So you need to choose a font that works for you. We wanted something that was a little bit kind of a block type font. And so what we chose is the Statler, and we're going to make it bold. Let me show you the difference. If I left click on regular, see the letter is not quite as wide, but we're going to left click on bold to make it wider. So Joyce, does this work for you? Does that look okay?
We need to grab it with our F10 handles and make it a little bit smaller because we need to be able to trim it so that it's inside the edges.
Right, but I can say okay now.
Sure.
And I'm going to take this and I'm going to switch to F10 handles. Because that is the center handles, then what that's going to do is make it smaller and still anchor the center. You want to pay attention to what this height is right here, because we need all our letters to be pretty uniform. So we want to pay attention to what that height is so that our other letters are the same way. Once we get that done, then we can go and quilt it out, and what we did was use the same color thread as the felt. So we're going to quilt that out. Now we are using tie-offs on this, which is not something that I normally do, but we are using tie-offs, and our all-over quilting is underneath the felt, so it will be underneath the letter. So let us get that done and we'll come back.
We've decided, because of the size of the letter, that we will do a echo inside. So I'm going to select the letter, go to Echo Object, and you can see that the last time that an echo was done, because Creative Studio remembers what you did the last time, that the spacing was at 0.03. Well, for this particular pattern, Creative Studio can't do a 0.03, so it gave us an error. So we're going to say OK and cancel. And you'll see that it had trouble. But we don't want a 0.03 inside echo anyways. So what we want is an inside echo. And if you have trouble with inside echo, you need to click inside the object that you're trying to echo. Let's increase the spacing to a 1/2 inch, Joanne?
1/2 inch would give us a good definition.
So 1/2 inch, and now we have an inside echo.
Right, and now it does it correctly. And it didn't want us to click the inside because this is a simple shape, but the majority of the time you have to left click on that inside after you select inside echo. It's another step and you need to do that. So I think that's going to give us some real good definition. So we'll say OK and we'll stitch this out. We have that letter stitched out. If it were us, we would start a new quilt group, because when you roll the quilt back, you would be quilting on top of this same letter in this same boundary. So the easiest thing to do is just start you a new quilt group after you roll the quilt back. There's no reason to relocate. There's no reason to do any of that, because you're going to another block. Set your next letter the same way that we explained this. Echo it on the inside if you would like to, but I can tell you that it gave some really nice dimension to our quilt, because this is such a large letter and it looks really good. So I think we have finished with our little stadium throw, Joyce.
I do too. I would just stick in one last reminder, is that because we're at the bottom of the quilt, remember when you're placing these letters, if you place the letters from bottom up, whatever letters you have decided to do, make sure that you do them in the reverse so that you don't end up with SUL or,
exactly.
or USL instead.
But you could also do initials. You know, it'd be a cute wedding throw or whatever. You could do initials. It could be a cute baby blanket and do the initials of the baby, because normally there are 3 initials in a name, so it doesn't have to be a stadium blanket. It can be whatever you want it to be and put the letters in. But it is a really quick, easy project.
I see an AIO in my future.
I bet you do.
So until next time,
We thank you for joining us. Let us know if you have any questions.